The Gospel according to Mark. As Jesus came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another, all will be thrown down." When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked Jesus privately, "Tell us, when will this be, and what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished?" Then Jesus began to say to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is but the beginning of the birth pang." Bye, Darian. So I have a friend named Harry who likes to say that his life hasn't been very challenging. And I'm really happy for him that he interprets his life this way. But I'm curious about the psychology of a person who would say such a thing. My life has not been challenging, when he is 48 years old and has had enough years to see something hard. So I asked Harry, "Do you ever feel worried or anxious?" "I worry about things," he said. And then he paused and wasn't able to think about anything. If you are anything like me, however, worries are not hard to call to mind. Will the store sell out of my special lactose-free high-protein milk before I get there today? Is my friend who is experiencing depression okay right now? Will our Jewish friends at Temple Beth Israel continue to experience an upswing of anti-Semitism? Worry pops out of my psyche like little kernels of popcorn out of the popcorn maker. Many humans are prone to anxiety, to persistent worry and fear about either what might happen or what the effects of things that are happening will be. A Mary Oliver poem entitled "I Worried" begins, "I worried a lot. Will the garden grow? Will the rivers flow in the right direction? Will the earth turn as it was taught? And if not, how shall I correct it?" We worry about things in our control and outside of our control. And we who have a tendency toward this kind of cycle of worry long for reassurance, for an antidote to the tightness in our chest, the crushing feeling that things are not right now. I encounter the longing for reassurance often in my work as a nurse. Patients share so many worries with me. Will I be able to afford this hospital stay? Will the doctors figure out what is wrong with me? Will these psychiatric meds make me feel sick or take away vital aspects of my personality? As a pastor, I hear people longing for reassurance as well. Will God help me through this hard time? Will our country ever be less divided? Do we have enough resources to support our population? Will the capital C church keep shrinking? As a pastor and a nurse, I attempt to offer some of the reassurance people are yearning for. You are not alone. This is not the end of the story. It is curious to me, then, that in our gospel reading for today, Jesus seemingly does the opposite. Jesus' disciples are worried, and Jesus fans the flames of their anxieties. Let's go back and take a look at this text. In this section of the Gospel of Mark, we're in chapter 13, we find Jesus and his disciples in Jerusalem in the week before Jesus was going to be killed. Right, so Jesus was preparing to give himself up to the authorities, much to his disciples' chagrin. And we can only imagine that the disciples were worried and anxious. We might expect that Jesus would take every opportunity to reassure his disciples that everything would be okay in the end. This is not the end of the story. But at first glance, at least, this is not what Jesus did. So we read that one day, Jesus and the disciples visited the temple, right? This grand structure that was at the center of Jewish life. What large stones and large buildings, one of the disciples said to Jesus. And so they're departing, and he's just looking around in awe, right? Perhaps this disciple was feeling comforted that though his teacher, the one he was following, would soon be finding his end, this grand structure would always remain. So Jesus' response? Like, oh yeah, you're right. Isn't that nice? You have your church, your synagogue, your temple. No. Do you see these great buildings? Jesus says. Not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down. Wait, what? One commentator remarked that Jesus' declaration must have sounded to the disciples like Jesus was talking about the end of the world. The central part of Jewish life, this grand building, even that was subject to the forces of destruction. What then could the disciples be sure of in this life? And then, rather than offer his disciples reassurance, Jesus went on to predict that the disciples would hear of wars and rumors of wars. In the future, nation would rise against nation, the kingdom against kingdom. There would be earthquakes in various places. There would be famines. Cheerful. After such a speech, if any of the disciples weren't already overwhelmed with worry, how could they not be now? Jesus wasn't just offhandedly predicting death and destruction, however. Jesus' conversation with the disciples is an example of apocalyptic speech. Apocalypse meaning the total destruction of the world. Jesus' words echoed the apocalyptic predictions of many of the prophets in the Hebrew Bible, which we often refer to as the Old Testament. In the Hebrew Bible, prophets such as Joel announce that there are terrible things to come. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming. It is near, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness, Joel proclaims. Terrible things are coming in clouds and thick darkness. Does that remind you of anything? How many of you like doomsday movies? Anybody? The Hunger Games? The Day After Tomorrow? World War Z? Independence Day? Whether or not you like to engage apocalyptic stories in movies will put you in line with one of your two pastors. If you are going to have a doomsday movie night, you may extend the invitation to Andrew, and I will politely decline. I shudder even watching trailers for movies like these, because there's something so forlorn about them. Right? Waves of buildings going crumbling down, as the earthquake goes, and big clouds of dust rising up from destroyed cities. And it makes me feel anxious. I tend to shy away from stories of destruction. But I have to remember that there's a purpose behind apocalyptic literature in the Bible. Have you ever thought about why the prophets spouted doom and gloom to the people? They were trying to draw people into awareness that the way that the people were living was not in line with God's intentions. Wake up, the prophets seemed to implore. Turn to God and look to God's ways to dictate how you are going to live in this world. Similarly, there was a purpose to Jesus' apocalyptic musings. Jesus was making sure the disciples knew that the task of following him was going to get even harder after he was gone. And in the midst of the challenges, the disciples needed to hold fast to the way of Jesus and to be careful who they followed. Jesus said, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray." The context of Jesus' warning was that Israel had had a long history of trusting false prophets and following unfaithful leaders. The disciples needed to use what they knew about who Jesus is and what he was all about to discern who to follow and how to move forward in his absence. Beyond a call to hold fast to the way of God, Jesus and the prophets had another purpose for speaking apocalyptically. And it's related, actually, to the reason that many people are drawn to apocalyptic movies. So a summary of why people are drawn to such movies explains that these movies allow viewers to explore extreme situations, to examine human nature under pressure, and potentially confront their own anxieties about real-world threats, all the while offering a sense of catharsis through the narrative of survival and resilience in the face of destruction. So in other words, engaging such movies and stories moves us beyond sort of a dull, non-specific anxiety about what might happen to imagining that even in dire circumstances, all hope is not lost. Goodness and life can prevail. The gift of apocalyptic speech is that underneath the anxiety-provoking predictions, we hear Jesus sound a call to hope. Yes, things are going to be difficult, but everything in all of creation is still in the hand of God. Jesus does not leave the disciples with a picture of a gloomy future. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs, Jesus says at the end of the gospel passage. What is being birthed may not be clear at this moment, but the God of creation is still at work bringing life and love into the world. In our modern world, where the rapid pace of change and the complexity of our reality often leaves us feeling powerless and out of control, we may find ourselves longing to escape anxiety-provoking predictions. Our brains don't do well with the level of anxiety that is created when we are flooded with too many thoughts of looming catastrophe. But if we can bear it, the gift of entertaining apocalyptic thinking is that it can help us face our anxiety, to see the thing for what it is, move past our panic, and develop an imagination and an awareness of God's presence with us. We can acknowledge the things that terrify us or that terrify our neighbors. The shrinking of the church, the state of politics in this country, the climate crisis, wars, a global lack of resources, while also remembering that God, the ultimate source of creativity and life, promises this earth a future of shalom, of justice, and grace. There can be a danger in dwelling too long in apocalyptic thinking. If our brains remain in this anxiety, panic state for too long, we may freeze up, lose the ability to act, and forget who we are. And who are we? We are disciples of Jesus. God has called us to follow the way of Jesus as we journey through this life. Following the way of Jesus looks much the same in times of catastrophe or crisis as it does in times of relative calm. God calls us to worship. God calls us to be community for one another. God calls us to preach and teach the good news of God's Son. God calls us to clothe and feed our neighbors. God calls us to stand up against violence of any kind toward those who are vulnerable in our society. God calls us to be agents of peace, justice, and love. When we remember who we are and follow this call, God can work through us to offer reassurance and hope to the world. I want to acknowledge that right now, for many of us, this might sound like a heavy burden, while to others it can sound like a beautiful invitation. Fair enough, wherever you are. But if it seems like too much right now, this call to be a source of God's reassurance to the world, I want to leave you with something that my mom always tells me when I feel overwhelmed, when I look around and see all the need in the world and think, what can I possibly do to make a difference? Sis, my mom says, you're not God. The whole world is not in your hands. Remember the song. You focus on doing your part and let God do the hard work of saving the world. Friends, let us focus on doing our part. Our part, following Jesus, following the way of Jesus, and offering peace and love to a world in need. And leave the rest of the world in God's hands. We are not at the end of the story. No matter what we face, the God of creation is still at work, bringing life and love to this world. Amen.